Okay, good morning and good evening, everybody, depending what time zone you're in. I'm really glad to see we've got quite a lot of people on the line now who are listening in. We may have a few more join us over the next few minutes or so. But what we want to do is we'll get started and we'll do some introductions whilst those people join us. All participants are currently on mute. If you have any questions as we go along, please do ask them within the chat window on the WebEx, and one of us will try to answer your question either over the chat or verbally. We expect that this is going to take about 45 minutes for us to talk to you about the Soy Measurement Ladder, and then there will be time for some questions and answers at the end, and we hope to finish on the hour to allow you all to get on with your day or to finish for the evening. Just to very quickly introduce myself, I'm Ben Wielgus. I've been working in KPMG on stakeholder engagement and sustainability strategy now for more than 10 years. And it's been a great pleasure of mine to work with members of the Consumer Goods Forum and the Consumer Goods Forum itself for the last 2 years as part of a pro bono engagement that KPMG has been doing to help the CGF members accelerate their progress towards some of the sustainability commitments. So I'm one of the main designers of the Soy Ladder. I'm really glad to be able to talk to you about it today. And I'm joined by 2 team members who've been absolutely critical to that process as well. And just to give you some variety today, we'll each be taking different sections of this presentation. So I'll just quickly allow them to introduce themselves.
Hi there, my name's Nicola Costa. I also work in the KPMG Sustainability Services team, and I've also been working closely with the Consumer Goods Forum members and the Consumer Goods Forum on this particular project over the past 2 years.
Hi everyone, my name's Lucy. I sit in the same team as Nicola and Ben, and I've been working with CGF on this particular project for the last just over 12 months.
That's great. Thanks, both. And I'm really pleased today to be joined by Ignacio Gavilan, who's the Director of Sustainability at the Consumer Goods Forum. And we thought just to start off with, for those of you who haven't had a chance to work with the Consumer Goods Forum before, I'm going to ask him just to give a few minutes on the work of the Consumer Goods Forum and especially on soy.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. Good morning or afternoon or evening to everyone. Let me perhaps start with a quick reference to the CGF as an organization, because some of you might not be familiar. And also interesting to see how sustainability fits with the vision of the organization. So the Consumer Goods Forum, the CGF, is a global industry network. We bring together the CEOs and senior management of over 400 retailers, manufacturers, service providers, and a few other stakeholders across 70 countries. I think we provide a unique platform for knowledge exchange around 4 strategic priorities: sustainability, both social and environmental; safety through our GFSI program, Global Food Safety; health and wellness; and end-to-end value chain and standards, which is operational excellence for supply chain. The forum's vision, and you might have seen that in a few of the brochures, is better lives through better business. So in order to fulfill this, its members have given the forum a mandate to develop common positions on key strategic and operational issues affecting the consumer goods business. The forum's success is actually driven by you, by the members, and your active participation as key players in the sector. And you together develop and lead the implementation of the best practices along the value chain. So as it relates to what CGF members have committed to, last year the board of the Consumer Goods Forum called on heads of state across the world to engage and act with determination to secure an ambitious and legally binding global climate deal in Paris in a couple months. As part of its call for action around climate change, the forum had also renewed its own commitment to taking action through the now 3 board-approved climate change resolution, namely to help achieve zero net deforestation by 2020 through the sustainable sourcing of key commodities, soy being a very important one, to begin phasing out hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, in new refrigeration installations. And finally, and it was approved in June this year, to halve food waste throughout our members' operation by 2025. So, clear objectives. Now it's all down to very effective implementation. So for the specifics of soy, which is in the next slide, as part of the zero net deforestation commitment, you're all aware that soy is one of the major crops of the world. It's not only used for human food, but also for oil, animal feed, cosmetics, biofuels, etc. It has also been associated with negative social and environmental issues. And we are projected as humankind to consume 70 to 80 million metric tons of additional soybeans annually over the next 10 years. And this is linked to 80% of the world's soy production being fed to livestock as well. So CGF acknowledges its responsibility to ensure that the sourcing of these ingredients does not contribute to deforestation. And we have consequently taken action through the resolution that I mentioned before. So now the question is, how do we drive real and tangible sectorial change? Under the umbrella of this resolution, the CGF Sustainable Soy Working Group was created. It's currently led by the Dutch retailer Royal Ahold, and we at CGF convene and steer this group. The objective of the working group is to ensure that soy is sustainably sourced by all of our member companies. A fundamental outcome of the working group has been the development of the Sustainable Soy Sourcing Guidelines, which are freely available to our website should you wish to download. The CGF recognizes the complexity and length of the soy supply chain, and we called upon other stakeholders along the supply chain to work together to develop and implement these guidelines. These parties obviously include commodity traders and feed manufacturers, agricultural organizations, NGOs, etc. The Sustainable Sourcing Guidelines should be considered a living document, and we plan to update them with latest developments every other year if needed. We have also organized a number of workshops. In 2013, we went to Brussels, in 2014 to London, and this year we organized one in Brazil at the heart of the soy producing area in the capital in Brasilia. The Soy Working Group, needless to say, is always open for new members, and it's currently engaged on the implementation of these guidelines across the industry with a focus on Latin America. A series of webinars and workshops will continue to be organized. So, the guidelines are an excellent document. However, in order to better support members on this very complex and almost thorny task of soy footprinting, we were fantastically advised and supported by KPMG, who is, by the way, a long-standing member of CGF, 15 plus years with us, and they developed over the past year something that provides structure and a consistent approach to reporting. It is practical, simple, it is adaptable, allows for comparison, as you will see, and can be used by all members regardless of the activity. And this is the Soy Ladder. So in summary, through the Soy Ladder, we're seeking to accelerate the progress of measurement to meet the needs of these stakeholders sooner and better. This document presents a way of displaying your organization's soy footprint that shows the relative impact of different parts of the supply chain and demonstrates what proportion of the soy footprint is at risk of causing deforestation. As always, we welcome debate and suggestions and challenges with a view to developing a standard approach to measurement soy usage in a consistent, granular way that will enable us understanding and action to be taken against deforestation. So enough from me. Thank you all very much for your attendance and your continued support. And I leave you in the good hands of Ben, Nicola, and Lucy, who will go through specifics of the Soy Ladder, and a very good day and afternoon for you all.
Thanks, Ignacio. Thanks for those words as well. So before we get into the detail of the work that we've done and the framework that we've produced at the CGF, I thought it'd be a good chance now to just very quickly look at what soy is to make sure we're all on the same page. So soy is an edible legume. It's a very naturally high source of protein, and we come across soy in a huge array of products in our day-to-day life. We can buy soy straight from the shelf as soy milk or soybeans, and because it's a high source of protein, we'll also come across it in a lot of the foods that we eat, largely because soy is added to animal feed used for rearing animals for human consumption. So we'll either eat these animals directly or we'll use them to make processed foods. Soy is also used to make derivatives that are added to products such as chocolate, candles, and cosmetics. So we find it in products absolutely everywhere. And as the demand for these products has grown, so has the demand for soy. And this has led to pressure on ecosystems where the soy is grown, particularly those high-value ecosystems, which has resulted in deforestation in areas such as South America. As these impacts on the environment have grown, pressure within the industry in terms of soy has also increased, and we've become more aware that soy is something we really need to get a handle on and really need to understand in terms of its origin and where we're sourcing it. And whilst that consensus is recognised in the industry, at the moment there aren't many companies able to report their soy consumption accurately, and those that are facing quite a few challenges that we'll go through in a bit more detail. And largely this is the result of a lack of guidance to refer to and very few consistent methods that are available for companies to use. So instead of fully understanding soy consumption, companies are having to focus on their material uses such as meat. We just discussed that the soy in products that enter the supply chain at lots of different stages, which we'll touch on a bit later in the webinar in more detail. And this adds an extra level of complexity when trying to report soy. There's also a very limited supply of sustainable soy globally, and a lot of discussion and debate around certified soy and where those certifications have come from. So we'll now go through some of the challenges in a little bit more detail.
Thanks, Lucy. So all of these complexities that Lucy touched on in relation to the soy supply chain, how soy is sourced and how it's used throughout the value chain for its various products, means that it is actually inherently difficult to therefore measure the soy consumption for many organisations. And this is the reason why we've set out to develop this particular framework to measure soy. Now this slide sets out some of the common challenges in measuring soy in a bit more detail, and I won't go into all of them, but I really wanted to kind of pull out a few of them to give a little bit more background as to why we've created the Soy Ladder that we're discussing today. So when we're talking about varying feed mixes, for example, when it comes to measuring soy and the meat supply chain, there are kind of many variances between feed mixes for different animals and different locations. So there's different requirements for some of these animals in terms of protein requirements and foraging access. And this is also linked to the issue that the soy supply chain is heavily decentralized. So the feed production and the processing of food containing soy is very much decentralized, which means that businesses have to therefore engage with a number of suppliers in order to obtain data on their soy use. And this means that having a common framework that kind of sets to address some of these challenges, such as with the Soy Ladder, will help to overcome some of these in calculating your soy footprint.
Great. Thank you, Nicola. So on these challenges that we've had, members have been grappling with, we have essentially been trying to help CGF understand at first how important its members are in the global soy supply chain and what kind of scale and buying power they've got. Now, the first piece of work we did for the Consumer Goods Forum was actually working in the palm oil sector, where CGF's members really wanted to know, as a group of 200 manufacturers and retailers of soy around the world, that they wanted to see how much palm oil they bought, and therefore they could actually start to leverage that industry to shift. So we took all publicly available data on the palm oil footprint of a number of the retailers and manufacturers in CGF, and that was about 50. and we converted that into a metric that allowed us to extrapolate it out over the whole of the Consumer Goods Forum population. That gave us an idea that approximately CGF members buy around 15% of the global palm oil market and therefore have a really significant ability to change that industry. After that, and the positive feedback we had from that work, we actually did the same piece of work for soy. Now, soy has been much more difficult. In our work on this over the last 12 months, we couldn't find a single retailer or manufacturer who publicly published their soy footprint. And we essentially had to go around and interview volunteer CGF members who'd done the work behind the scenes to practice on their soy footprints, and then use that data to extrapolate it out over the whole soy footprint. So we did interview 10 members, and we found that each member had approached this in a different way. You know, those challenges that Nicola talked about in terms of risks of double counting, understanding of the supply chain, varying product boundaries, these were all coming out very, very clearly in the conversations we had with members. And we sort of came across a fair amount of frustration amongst them that they were all having to effectively make it up as they go along, or spend a lot of money trying to actually work through the problems when, if they had something like the greenhouse gas protocol, but for soy, it was going to be considerably easier. We did manage to get some data, though. We filtered that based on quality, and we were able to remove a number of anomalies that came up, and that allowed us to factor in all of the soy usage for retailers and manufacturers across the CGF. I'll show you the results on the next page, but in typical consultant style, I did want to just start with a few caveats. We have a small sample here, so whereas for palm oil we did it for around 50 pieces of data, we only had 10 soy footprints to work with from the retailers and manufacturers we talked to, and most of that was a partial footprint, so they looked at certain products or certain countries. We did find a number of errors in that data. Some of them were quite significant, but we all acknowledged it was internal working data only, and therefore it's something that's being developed over time. Methods and boundaries are, of course, different, as we talked about, and it's a question of trying to work with the quantities first to understand the buying power, but there's still a further phase of work to do in looking at the source of the soy, because obviously soy coming from different places will present a varying risk of deforestation. So, the results. The graph on here that you'll see, essentially we worked out the soy footprint for every single member of the Consumer Goods Forum based on estimates of their consumption of soy and their revenues. The ranking is from the largest consumers of soy on the left to the smallest consumers of soy on the right, and then we add them up. So it's a cumulative soy usage. What it told us is that the Consumer Goods Forum members as a whole buy potentially up to 10% of global soy production. And that's split down between 3 and 6% for the retailers and 1.5 to 3% for the manufacturers. We were very careful here wherever possible to avoid double counting, because we know that the retailers will sell many of the products made by the manufacturers. So we tried to set a baseline estimate that said that the manufacturer soy footprint is excluded from the retailer soy footprint. Now, in total, that's about 12 to 24 million tons of soy a year against a global harvest of about 260 million tons, and approximately 60% of the consumption from CGF members comes from South America, which for those of you on the line who are intimately familiar with soy, you will know that soy from South America generally presents a higher risk of deforestation than soy from anywhere else. Although our colleagues over at WWF and elsewhere, they're obviously increasingly interested in the soy that comes from North America, because some feel that there's still loss of high-value ecosystems in Canada and Northern America. That is obviously one for debate later on. Now, following that work, we saw a very common theme emerging, and I'm going to ask Nicola to take you through a little bit about, so you get a break from my voice, and then I will come in and explain to you exactly how the ladder works.
Great. Thank you, Ben. So as Ben touched on briefly, when we were interviewing the 10 largest users of soy in the CGF, we started to hear some really consistent messages from them. We kind of realized that all of the companies really wanted to get on and measure their soy usage and their material soy usage, but the process was really quite inefficient. Each member was developing their own methods of the data collection, calculation, and their own supply chain surveys, and focusing on different areas of soy use. And this potentially kind of meant there was a bit of wasted effort and sometimes frustration from suppliers of meat, dairy, or feed who were receiving some different questionnaires and different formats and with differing timeframes to suit all of the organizations. And it also meant that the data was perhaps not overly comparable with other members, so that you can get a consistent view on how much soy was being used across the group. So with that in mind, we realized that to accelerate members to be able to kind of consistently and efficiently and usefully measure how much soy they were using, a methodology was needed that, as Ben mentioned, could act like the GHG protocol for measuring carbon footprints. And this kind of means that once companies can actually measure their soy footprint in a standard way, the whole sector could then start to actually concentrate on tracing the most material areas of where they're using soy and ensuring that much of it is sustainable. And this then led to the creation of the CGF Soy Measurement Ladder, which has been reviewed and drafted also in collaboration with the CGF Soy Working Group as well as some other stakeholders, and now has been adopted as the CGF standard for measuring soy.
Great. Thank you, Nicola. So we now have what we think is the world's first standard on being able to talk about soy boundaries and soy footprints in a consistent way. We are starting to hear that a number of those organizations who want to capture data from stakeholders on their soy footprints are asking to use this framework to start to gather the data. And what I want to do now is just try and take you through the fundamental principles of how the Soy Ladder breaks up the data to make it more understandable and more comparable. We found on the WebEx that we did 2 days ago that this is perhaps the most challenging slide to explain, and I can actually spend an hour on it if you all wanted, but I suspect not many people would want to put their hands in the air for that. So what I am going to do is I'm going to talk you through this very briefly. If there are any questions on it at the end, by all means, please do ask them. The Soy Ladder guidance, which you've hopefully all received from the Consumer Goods Forum, also talks about this in a lot more detail. So essentially, in those conversations that we had with the soy retailers and manufacturers that have been involved in this, we listened to them and the work they've done on the boundaries, and we found that people were commonly breaking up their soy usage into various clusters, and there was some consistent patterns in that. So what we're trying to do is draw out the best of that into here. The Soy Measurement Ladder as well, it's a way of measuring, but it is not an incredibly accurate scientific approach. That's all based on how good your data is. But what the Soy Ladder does is it allows you to understand where to prioritize your actions. And what we found a lot of the retailers were doing so far is they were taking the time to actually work out where they should be spending their management effort on managing their soy footprint and which parts of their product portfolios really needed the attention to understand the data better, because potentially that's where the soy is higher risk. So the first thing that almost everybody did was they looked at what we've called the region layer, this blue bar at the top. And that's essentially starting from their sales or their revenue figures, essentially deciding whether they want to look at their sales across all of the world, or, as a lot of them were doing at the moment, they're excluding North American sales. That's because North America is a net exporter of soy, and so the general assumption is any revenue made on products manufactured or sold in North America is done so using soy from North America, and there is very little risk of deforestation from soy that is made in North America. As I talked about earlier, of course, there is still the risk of high-value ecosystems loss, so we are expecting that those people who are ignoring North American sales at the moment are going to include them in the future, particularly when you want to report the organization's soy footprint rather than just the soy that is linked to deforestation. So we think there's going to be a gradual maturing of that market, and I'm already starting to see a number of clients including their North American sales down in their calculations. Once you've decided whether you want to focus on the revenue from all of the world or just specific geographies, the next layer we talk about is the brand layer. So we've mentioned this already, but essentially almost everybody we talked to was only looking at the brand products they sell or the brand products they manufacture. So for retailers, that is looking at the supply chain that they have the most control over. And for manufacturers, it's looking at the products they make, but not any products they might resell. So quite a few of the manufacturers we talked to had 5, 10, 15, 20% of their business, which were products that they were just reselling on behalf of others as part of a portfolio. So those two are pretty simple. Hopefully they make sense. Very quickly we found that that allowed people to focus down, maybe down to approximately 50% of the number of product lines quite quickly, especially in retailers. The next one is where it starts to get a little bit more complex, and that's what we call the product layer. So the product layer is recognizing that soy usage is generally embedded in the supply chain for food, and that's particularly meat, eggs, and dairy. But also, we had a couple of pharmaceutical manufacturers on the call a couple of days ago. They were saying they have soy within their personal care products, so moisturizers and things like that, using soybean oil, and household products such as cleaners that contain methyl soyates. So it's really important not to ignore those, particularly if you're a manufacturer in the Consumer Goods Forum of the more non-food items. There's a final area, of course, in the product layer, which is non-food items. So most retailers these days, they will sell everything from TVs to clothing to DVDs. Obviously, the soy footprint of the DVD is pretty low, as are most other products in that area. So very quickly, we can ignore those categories unless there's something very unusual going on in the supply chain. Again, this is about narrowing the focus, but doing it in a systematic way so we can very quickly exclude some of the SKUs in the product lines. Then we're on to the ingredients layer, and this is where the real detail happens. It's possible through the work that we've done with a few retailers to get down to the ingredients layer within an hour of filtering the data usually. But the ingredients layer takes much more work and much more sophisticated data analysis to start to filter this out. Again, manufacturers have an easier time of this than retailers, but it's still something that's very, very important to bear in mind. And this is the ingredients layer in terms of where the soy usage occurs in the supply chain and where that product turns up in the end produce that is sold. So the first one is really easy. This is soy sold as a product itself. So this is soy milk, soybean oil, edamame beans, essentially anything you can get the quantity of sales for and the weight of each product, multiply one by the other, and you've got a pretty good idea of how much soy it's taken to do that. The next step is where soy is used for a feed for the raw product. So this is everything from fresh meat sold in shells or used in the manufacturing of products through to the eggs and dairy that are sold in a pure form on the shelf. Again, this is relatively easy. You can take the quantity of the product sold, multiply by the weights of the product, and then what you need to do is find the conversion factors that go from a kilogram of beef, for example, to the usage of soy to produce that beef. There is a Dutch university that has already published a number of conversion factors, I believe for beef, pork, and chicken, but a lot more work needs to be done on this, and we're finding that most of the retailers and manufacturers we've spoken to have been surveying the supply chain individually. I think that's where the frustration is coming from in the supply chain, is they're getting a lot of surveys now, each in a different format, each asking for different things. So that's one area we think the industry can improve, is trying to have standard surveys of the supply chain, or even standard data sets, which we'll come on to talk about in a few slides. The next area, this bit in the middle, this is perhaps where it starts to get really complicated. This is where things like meat, eggs, and dairy are used as ingredients in another product which is sold on the shelf, or in another product that's purchased for use in the manufacturing of products if you're a manufacturer. So I'm just going to pause here and just talk about that a little bit more. For a retailer, the focus has always been on the products that you can sell in working out your soy footprint. It's the main way of calculating how much soy is being used. For a manufacturer, there are two approaches to calculation. One is you can look at the raw materials you're buying in to produce your products and use that as the basis of the data to calculate your soy footprint. That is how things are often calculated and broken up. But it is also possible to use the data of the products you're selling. When I come to the next slide, you'll see why that latter one proves to be a lot more difficult and a lot more complicated. But the fundamental thing is you're probably buying far fewer types of raw material and raw ingredients than you are making end products. So it's easy to stick with the simpler, purer data set. When a soy feed is used as an ingredient, the extra complexity here is you need to look at the products that's being sold, such as frozen pizza, and work out the quantity of cheese and the quantity of pepperoni and the quantity of ham and the quantity of everything else that goes into that product, and then use that to extrapolate back to the pure quantities of ham, beef, pork, chicken, eggs, etc., and then use the conversion factors. So we've broken those out separately because they're considerably harder to work out. It involves a lot more data. The last two on here very quickly, soy derivatives used in products. So this is primarily things like lecithin used in chocolate. And so if you're using a lot of chocolate in your manufacturing or you sell a lot of chocolate, this is a big deal. And finally, the personal care and household products we've already talked about. I hope you're all with me with that, but essentially we're boiling that down to a higher risk of deforestation coming from food sales in the rest of the world and are focused on own brand products. Once you've considered those boundaries, and different organizations can choose different boundaries, we then move on to what we call the ladder. And this is the hub of what I wanted to talk to you about. The ladder is essentially just a systematic way of thinking about those products along the ingredients line we've just talked about. What we hope, and what Erlen and CGF and IDH and others are trying to do, is actually talk to those stakeholders who are asking all of you for data and get them to accept that it's not possible for most retailers and manufacturers to calculate an entire soy footprint in year one. It's just too much data, and what we find is people are under-resourced to be able to do this, or it's consuming too much of the budget that people would rather spend on actually managing the soy supply chain. So what we hope is that the likes of WWF and the RTRS and others, they will ask potentially next year for data on tier 1, 2, and 3. Maybe the year after that, they will ask for data on tiers 4A and 4B. And finally, by the time we get to 2020, we hope that most retailers and manufacturers in the Consumer Goods Forum will be able to talk about tier 5 as well. Now, these are ranked in order of ease of doing the calculation and in order of likely materiality, by and large, but it does depend on your product mix. For example, a UK retailer will probably sell far more ready meals as a proportion of their revenue than a Dutch or a French retailer, because the nature of the UK market is we tend to prefer more convenience food, and therefore there's more ready meals sold. I'm going to do this very, very quickly because this echoes what you saw on the previous page. It's subtly different, but tier 1 is the direct purchase soy and derivatives. So essentially things that are very, very easy to calculate. Tier 2 and 3 are the raw meat, eggs, and dairy. So again, the calculation approaches for these are very similar, although the conversion factors are very, very different between raw meat, eggs, and dairy, because obviously one involves a slaughterhouse and a limited life on the animal, the other is an ongoing production. Tier 4A and 4B, most people think I'm slightly mad that we have a 4A and 4B here. The reason we decided to do this is because you will almost always calculate 4A and 4B together. It's not a single step, but a double step. That's because if you take a product like a frozen lasagna, you do need to look at what kind of meat or vegetable is used in that lasagna and work out quantities. But while you're doing it and examining the product ingredient list, you can also do the eggs and dairy content as well. Tier 5, finally, is the embedded indirect soy. Most retailers and manufacturers will not be spending a significant amount of time here, but it will give a more complete footprint, and therefore we decided to leave that until last. I hope that makes sense. I'm conscious that it's a lot to get through. What I'd like to do now is just show you roughly the purpose behind this. So this is a suggested graph of how people could report soy publicly or internally if they want to look at it. What we see is as you go up this hierarchy, you go through the various tiers, and we've used these little circles to represent the quantity of soy that is believed to be embedded in the supply chain at each level. We deliberately decided to go for something that is graphical and not a numeric data set. That's because there is so much estimation and extrapolation involved in most soy footprint calculations that an exact number is meaningless. There are such large error boundaries on this. But at the moment, the best thing to do is to use this as a way of focusing efforts and helping management and stakeholders understand where the relative risk lies. So here, very quickly, you can see the most bubbles exist on Tier 4A. This is clearly a UK or US-based retailer because they're selling a lot more ready meals with meat and veg than any other product. If we were to do this for a German retailer or South American retailer, we would see this looking very different. What we've also done is we've added another layer on this. So in theory, when you survey the supply chain to get the data on the amount of soy, it's also possible to capture roughly where that soy comes from and the amount of risk it presents. So on the left-hand side of the diagram in red is what we call the at-risk soy. So the at-risk soy is where either the supply chain can't tell you where it's coming from, or it is known to come from areas of South America that are linked to deforestation, and we have no further data on whether it is from a safe source or not. On the right-hand side of the line is where the soy looks like it's come from a safe area that is probably not linked to deforestation. So this could be a North American soy or an area of South America that has a moratorium in place or is relatively unscathed by deforestation. And then finally, certified soy, we think it's important to capture that because that is much easier to trace in the supply chain, and we want to allow people to get the credit for that. And ultimately, it's probably the most reliable way of determining that soy is sustainable or not. You'll notice we haven't used the word sustainable or the word safe on here anywhere because at the moment the systems and the supply chain are still working their way through, and therefore we've got feedback from a lot of people that they should be avoiding any real certain claims that it's deforestation free, although you'd hope that if it was certified that things would be better. Okay, so we want to tell you what next. What do you do when you go away from this call? The Soy Ladder is now published, so the front cover of that one does need updating, but the Soy Ladder is now out in the world and free for everybody to use. I think it's really important to point out here the work we did for the Consumer Goods Forum was pro bono, and we did it to support our clients and other members of the Consumer Goods Forum deal with their soy footprint. So please feel free to adopt this, use it as much as you like. We really hope this will become an industry standard in the way that the GHG protocol did, because it's going to help us all just get on with the job of managing soy rather than trying to figure out how we talk about it. The CGF Soy Footprint methodology has been written to support this. So this is the actual ways of potentially calculating the soy footprint at each tier of the ladder. That's a much more substantial document. It's 50 pages long. It is very detailed. It's actually not a very exciting read, if I'm honest, but it is incredibly useful if you don't know where to start in doing your calculations and you want to understand the options for doing it. That document is currently being trialed by a couple of the members of the Consumer Goods Forum. We would love to have a couple of other members come to us and trial it as well. It works for manufacturers and retailers, and we would be very happy to share that if people want to get in touch. It is not a publicly available document at the moment because it does need to be approved by the CGF Soy Steering Group, but as I say, we are currently testing that and seeing how it works. The final area is there is currently a pilot ongoing, which is actually a software tool that is going to accelerate the compliance and calculation of soy footprints. And this is really where I want to finish. Not so much as a plug for KPMG work, but as a highlight that we would really welcome particularly retailers who want to come on board with this pilot. What we found is that in the conversations with the retailers and manufacturers that we've spoken with, there is still an awful lot of money, resource, and time being spent on calculating soy footprints. It's often in the hundreds of thousands of euros to get a complete soy footprint, and that is causing an awful lot of challenge, and it's going to slow down the adoption of soy footprinting in the industry. So we have proposed a test, a grand experiment is how we tend to be referring to it, working with IVH, the KPMG, CGF, and 5 retailers who want to take part. The idea is that we have built what is, for best description, is a vaguely intelligent artificial system that will read your sales data and divide up all of your products into tier 1, 2, 3, 4A, 4B, and 5 automatically. So it can do all the hard work of categorizing the products. That will give you an idea of revenue and volume of sales at each level of the ladder. The next step would be to calculate that data, into a soy footprint. And right now, there are only 3 pieces of data publicly which allow you to do that conversion. That is not enough for the complete product line and the complete ladder. And so a lot of retailers and manufacturers have been surveying their supply chains we've talked about and causing a lot of frustration and inconsistency because there's lots of data requests flying around. So what we've proposed is that we all work together and share the data on the conversion factors that we've been able to gather, and then as a group survey the supply chain once. Now, obviously, this is going to potentially present some antitrust rules, so what we suggest is that KPMG operate as what we call a black box. So we can do the survey on behalf of people and keep the data incredibly confidential. We've done this with salary benchmarks, with tax benchmarks, and a number of the financial metrics. So our systems are rated to be able to deal with this kind of confidentiality, and it gives us some impartiality in the middle. It also allows us to develop some industry standard benchmarks and levels for what good looks like in the supply chain. And we think that by working together, it can also significantly reduce the cost to everyone involved, both the supply chain and the retailers themselves. We hope that we can get the supply chain involved through CGF's relationships with the feed suppliers and the soy associations around the world, and we really hope that this is going to help set the standard going forward. What we've agreed is that KPMG will pay 1/3 of the cost of the pilots, IDH will pay 1/3 of the cost, and we're proposing that the 5 retailers who are on board with this will pay for 1/15 of the cost each. So it's a very small commitment, and actually what we found is the retailers who've already come on board, their challenge is making staff time available, and so we're putting in place systems to help them do that very efficiently so that most of the work is done by KPMG and IDH to make sure that they're participating as simply as possible. This will give the people in the pilot a soy footprint under the ladder and an idea of where their most material soy usage is, and hopefully an idea of where the risk is. But it is a pilot. This is why everybody is contributing to the pilot, because we're all trying to see if this is even possible. But if we can make it work, we think it will really set the standard for consumer goods for our members and save the supply chain a lot of work. It will give IDH and others some data to be able to understand the supply chain more, and we think it will really accelerate progress towards this and allow a lot of other members to benefit from the work of the pilot companies. I hope that doesn't sound like a hard sell. We're really keen that people come on board. If you are interested in knowing more in anything we've talked about, either the methodology document that we've said will be available soon, or the pilots, or if you have any other questions that you don't want to ask about on the call, then our contact details are here on screen, and I'm sure you can reach us through your Consumer Goods Forum contacts as well. I am going to finish there. We did say it would take 45 minutes, and I'm pleased to say it's taken us 43 minutes to talk to you about the soy ladder, so hopefully that shows that it is relatively simple. But I will now be taking questions for the next 5 to 10 minutes, if anybody has them. So what we'll do is we will take questions either over the chat window, which I know some of you have been using, but we are also going to unmute the lines so that if anybody wants to ask any questions verbally, you are very welcome to do so. Please note, though, we do get a lot of background noise from people who are listening in cafes or whilst traveling, so if you are not going to ask a question, can I please just ask you to put your phone on mute, just so we don't pick up that background noise? I'll give you a second to do that, and then we will unmute the lines. Okay, I believe the lines are now all unmuted, so I would welcome any questions from anybody about that if you think we've missed something, or if you have any further thoughts. Everybody's always shy with the first question. I may then choose to take that as an incredible compliment that we explain things very clearly, and hopefully not that it was all very common sense to you all. We've had more than 25 people come through the call this morning from a huge range of organizations, from the U.S. Embassy to Ahold and some very exciting other members, so thank you so much for joining us today. We have actually just received a question, so there was a number of people asking if the pilot is open to manufacturers. The pilot is open to manufacturers, but we actually think that manufacturers are going to have a considerably easier time of meeting the requirements of the ladder than others, because if you focus on your raw materials coming in, that's a relatively limited feedstock in terms of products. So you probably know exactly how much beef you buy or how many eggs you buy, and the challenge is just talking to those suppliers and understanding the conversion factors. The conversion factors are probably where the manufacturers will benefit, because they will benefit from publicly available data that we're gathering on that and the black box data that we're gathering. We'd also love to have some manufacturers or various soy associations involved or feed manufacturers involved, because we think you're that little bit closer to the data and therefore will be able to help us collate data that goes in the black box and save a lot of your members and supply chain time and having to submit it separately. So thank you for that question. I will give it another 30 seconds in case anybody has anything else. I know we're picking up a little bit of noise on the line at the moment. Okay, I think we'll finish there then. Thank you everybody for joining us. CGF will be following up with an email to you all in the coming weeks with more information and links to the recording. But again, please enjoy your days, and thank you again for your time.